Good. So again, here's the Chakira. Chakira means two ways of understanding a single halachic concept. In this case, the halachic concept we said was Birchat HaMitzvah, a bracha that's attached to a mitzvah. And now we have two possibilities. One is that the bracha is part of the mitzvah. And I want to expand on that a little bit today. And the other possibility is that no, the bracha is what? A separate entity. It's a chiyuv, an obligation unto itself. So again, do we subsume Birchas HaMitzvah as a subcategory of the mitzvah? In other words, the mitzvah is only complete when we have both the Maisa mitzvah and the bracha. Or do we say no? The Maisa mitzvah stands on its own, and the bracha stands on its own. They're two separate obligations, independent one of the other. Of course, we'd like it to be independent because then we get double credit. You know what I'm saying? You get more brownie points. But that's just a joke. You'll always get the same brownie points, no matter what theoretical conclusions you come to. But in theory, if I was counting mitzvot, does anybody know who counted mitzvot? To get to what magic number? Everybody, what magic number? 613. Who counted those mitzvot? The Rambam. I don't think the Ramban did, but Rav Sacha Gaon did, and Baal Halachas. Many Rishonim and Tachlonim.
112. One person counted 113.
Yeah, we have different numbers more at the end of us, but whatever it is, if you were to count Birchas HaMitzvah and the mitzvah itself, would it be counted as two mitzvot or as one? You follow me? If we're going to say that the bracha stands on its own, as what? As an independent chiyuv, then I might count it as another mitzvah in the Taryah. If on the other hand it's just part of the mitzvah, then we already have 613 mitzvahs, and the bracha is just part of each mitzvah. So far, so good. Then we get back to another concept that we mentioned yesterday called the Zman HaMitzvah. We said the Zman HaMitzvah means the time when the chiyuv HaMitzvah applies. If we're going to say that what? That the bracha is part of the mitzvah.
When the time frame applies.
Then the time limitation for the mitzvah also applies to the bracha. Let me expand on that a little bit. If the bracha is part of the mitzvah, then what we're saying is that we're expanding our definition of the Maaseh mitzvah. You want to write that down? Maaseh mitzvah is again a key concept that's going to come up over and over again every time we learn about another mitzvah. What is the Maaseh mitzvah? The act of the mitzvah. If there are 613 mitzvahs, then each one deserves a definition of a Maaseh mitzvah. And the action of the mitzvah starts here and ends here. We could say it starts with A and ends with Z at the end of the Maaseh mitzvah. Where does the bracha fit in? Is the bracha to be placed within that spectrum of the Maaseh mitzvah? Which means that it's what? Part of the mitzvah. Or no. The Maaseh mitzvah begins with the Maaseh and ends with the Maaseh. The bracha is something separate. In a sense, the bracha stands on its own. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Please ask questions if it's not clear. So therefore, the Maaseh mitzvah certainly has to be implemented after the Zman Chiyuv. If I were to perform the Maaseh mitzvah before the Chiyuv, like for example, I gave you an example yesterday, I put on tefillin in the middle of the night, or I read Kriyat Shema Shel Shacharis before sunrise, then that Maaseh mitzvah doesn't count. Because the Maaseh mitzvah has to be within a time frame called the Zman HaChiyuv. But if I come along and I say, no, the Maaseh mitzvah does not include the bracha is something independent of the Maaseh mitzvah, then I come to the conclusion that the Maaseh mitzvah begins with the Shas HaChiyuv, but perhaps the bracha could come before the Shas HaChiyuv. And why? Because bracha is an independent obligation.
The AC.
Oh, the AC, yeah, please feel free. I mean, it's your prerogative, you know. Okay, then. And now I want to introduce to you a statement of the Chachmas Adam. Please write that down. The Chachmas Adam, otherwise known as the Chaye Adam, same author, said just a few words about him. His name was Rav Avram Danzig. Again, I'd love you to write that down because you'll impress, when you go out with these fancy Michallah girls, you'll impress them. Oh, I know who Rav Avram Danzig was. Okay, you never heard of Michallah? That's good. Anyway, so what I want to tell you is the following. That many people know Rav Avram Danzig as the author of something called Tefillah Zaka. Is there anyone here in this room that heard of the Tefillah Zaka? No. Okay. You're here in Yeshiva. You'll be here on Erev Yom Kippur, I believe. Maybe you'll be zoche to hear of the Tefillah Zaka, which was authored by Rav Avram Danzig about 150 years ago, the author of the Chaye Adam. Okay, then? Now I'm going to ask you to take out your pages. Is there anyone here who needs pages for today? Okay, I have some extra copies here if anybody needs. Don't be embarrassed. And I want you to turn to page Tuf Kuf Sadi Bet, which should be the first page of the series of 4 pages that we photocopied. Can everyone take out that? That's it?
It's the wrong notebook.
Okay, Tuf Kuf Sadi Bet. How many people have it? Show of hands. Yeah, you have it. See the second paragraph below the middle of the page. Ukfa. Okay. Anybody here want to read that out loud? Just don't all, author and volunteer at once. Go ahead. Me. And if you don't mind, gentlemen, before you speak out loud, just mention your name. So slowly but surely I get your name.
I'm Sammy Grayson.
Sammy.
וכבר העיר בזה חיי אדם בנשמת אדם.
So again, the Chaye Adam wrote another book called Nishmat Adam. But he's most famous for the name Chaye Adam, but he wrote in another book of his called Nishmat Adam the following. Bekatav. What did he write?
וכתב, דאין אדם חייב לעקור מביתו וללכת לעיר אחרת, כדי לקיים מצוות שופר ביום שמצווה.
Kevan. That's a key word. That's like a pivotal word. Kevan, since.
כיוון שמצווה זו עדיין לא חלה אליו לפני ראש השנה.
לפני ראש. Okay, that's a mouthful. Has tremendous repercussions in our life. So I want you to underline or at least check off this paragraph with your pen. I have an extra pen here if anyone needs. Because this is a great takeoff point for our discussion. What is the Chaye Adam's view on whether or not I have to relocate myself before Rosh Hashanah to a city where I could hear shofar? Is the answer yes, I'm obligated, or no, I'm not obligated? Not obligated. Which word indicates not?
De'ein.
De'ein. So underline that word de'ein. And what does the word kavon mean?
Since.
Since. Excellent. Kavon is going to give us the insight as to why a person doesn't have to relocate themselves before Rosh Hashanah in order to hear shofar. Because I'll be honest with you, gentlemen, if you would ask me, I would have said, for sure you have to relocate yourself. If you don't have shofar here, well, how are you going to fulfill the mitzvah of shofar? Do everything in your power that's humanly possible to guarantee that you fulfill the mitzvah. And if you have to relocate yourself, that's what you should do. Says the Chaye Adam, no, you don't have to do them. Kavon, what's the Kavon? The Kavon is going to be I call it the segue
Because you're not required.
to explain why the Chayot believes that you don't have to relocate Yosef. Kevon. And what does he say, Kevon? Sammy, what does he say?
שמצווה זו עדיין לא חלה עליו לפני
Okay,
ראש
we're mentioning
השנה.
the key words here if you want to underline them.
עדיין לא חלה עליו.
Excellent. Adayin lo chol. What does the word chala mean? Okay, we're going to take a 3-minute break to explain the word chala because it's a key word. I'm trying to emphasize the key words that will come up over and over and over. Now, the dalid at the beginning of the word chala. No, I'm sorry, there is no dalid. Just the word chala. Now, chala is in the feminine because it's a reference to a mitzvah, but you could drop the hey at the end, and it could be the word chal. Now, that's a difficult word to translate, but it's a key word. It's mamish a key word. Let me try a few words, A, B, and C, to see if I can give you the flavor of what the word chal means. Anybody want to take a shot at it? Validate, generate, obligate. All these words, when you put them together, will give you the idea of chal. Every obligation must be generated. What does that mean? It has to be created. It has to be set into motion. For example, if you were to tell me now that tomorrow I have to put on tefillin, I would tell you that I'm not obligated to put on tefillin tomorrow. Shakespeare was famous for saying tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. You remember that? No? You didn't learn Shakespeare. See how generations have changed. We used to have to memorize Shakespeare in my day. Should I show up?
Yeah.
That is it.
Tomorrow
And tomorrow.
and tomorrow and tomorrow.
Base.
Excellent. Reeves penny pace. The last syllable of recorded time and all yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, weekend.
High school shadow or player that spreads our upon the sleeve. That is heard no one.
Excellent. I'm very
You did good be she would be.
extra few points for your knowledge of Shakespeare.
Most famous,
So tomorrow I'll be chayiv in tefillin. But don't tell me today. So is there a chal of the obligation of tefillin? Every chiyuv has to have something that generates it. Well, tomorrow is not here. Okay, what's that called when you say that it's not here? It doesn't exist yet. Okay, I want you to write this down again. It'll come up over and over again. Davar shelo ba li'olam. The halacha does not consider or reckon with something that's lo bala olam. It has to be common to me. For example, if a woman is going to give birth 9 months from now, I can't marry that baby because that baby is a dav shalom aliyah. Or for example,
But you can sell the fruit of a tree that hasn't grown yet.
okay, that's complicated. That's called avidi da'asi because you're basically selling the tree for its fruit, but you can't sell the fruit itself. Again, unless you're like a mayor, then you can't sell a dav shalom aliyah. But generally speaking, what I'm trying to convey to you is that tomorrow's chiyuv is a davar shalom aliyah. The chiyuv hasn't emerged yet, and therefore the obligation hasn't emerged yet. It's a davar shalom aliyah. It doesn't exist in the halachic universe. Okay. Absalom the Chayodah, and he says the following: I'm not obligated to relocate myself so that I can fulfill the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah because it's not yet Rosh Hashanah. If it's not yet Rosh Hashanah, then the chiyuv is not yet. Who can tell me the next word? Chal. It's not yet chal. If the chiyuv is not yet chal, the obligation hasn't emerged yet. It's not on the Richter scale, or shall I say, it's not on the computer screen of the halacha. Then I'm not obligated. If I'm not obligated, don't tell me what I have to do. Yeah.
You're not necessarily obligated, but then what happens, like, if I go into Sukkot and I say, okay, well, I'm not obligated to buy a lulav yet, and then Erev Sukkot comes, and I'm still not obligated, and then Sukkot comes, and now I can't buy lulav, and that's it, I just don't have to. So, like, you're not obligated.
And the same thing you should say in the case of the Chayodom. I mean, at what point do I have to guarantee myself that I'll hear the shofar?
Exactly.
Because if I keep postponing it and I say, well, it's a Davar Shalom Ololov, and this man
Like, when can you,
and I'll end up without a shofar. It's very complicated. This Chayodom is really complicated.
Sure, it's not a guarantee, but you still need to do it. Right?
I would think you have to do whatever you can, but he's saying no. It's not a smart chiyuv. It's not a smart chiyuv. I don't have to worry about it. It's not on my mindset. The chiyuv has not been chal. Are you getting the hang of this word chal? Now, if I don't have to worry about the mitzvah before the shas chiyuv, then at first glance, and please disagree with me on this point, but at first glance I would say I can't make a bracha before the zman chiyuv. Anybody see that connection? Let me try it. Okay, this is very challenging, but I'm going to try it. If I assume that the bracha is part of the mitzvah, then to the same extent that mitzvah doesn't obligate me before the zman chiyuv, then the bracha is likewise meaningless before the zman chiyuv. Because what we're saying is that there's no way that I can set up a chiyuv before the zman chiyuv. I don't have to relocate myself for the mitzvah of shofar. No, if there's no way of setting up that chiyuv, then how can I recite the bracha Baruch Atah Hashem Asher Kitshanu Mitzvosov Tzivanu, which is part of the mitzvah on shofar when I'm not even obligated to the mitzvah shofar? What do you say?
That would imply that you could never do a mitzvah before the mitzvah.
Correct. That would mean
No, like before the mitzvah ever, because you haven't done the mitzvah yet.
what do I mean ever? I'm in the zman chiyuv. Am I at 6:59 or at 7?
Yeah, but
if I'm at 6:59, it's no zman chiyuv.
About something which hasn't come into the world yet, and the mitzvah itself that you are about to do hasn't happened yet.
Well, no, the kickoff of the mitzvah is the bracha, right? Every mitzvah has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So what's the beginning of the mitzvah? The bracha. So I start the bracha, and therefore I start the mitzvah, but only if I have a zman chiyuv.
That only works so long as you're going with one set of hero.
Correct. So that's what I'm suggesting now, that apparently the only way that the Chai Adam could accept the possibility of reciting a bracha before the Zman HaChiyuv would be if he ascribed to the position that the bracha is a separate, independent entity. But if we're going to grant that the Chai Adam would agree, which we don't know, to that side of the Chakira, meaning that the bracha belongs and is the first stage of the Ma'aseh Mitzvah, then, since according to the Chai Adam, that mitzvah doesn't exist at all before the Zman HaChiyuv, how could you possibly make a bracha on something that doesn't exist? The whole idea of the bracha is to declare that you're out.
So the Chachman Adam never said that you can't do it before the time frame. He just said you're not required to. Like he said, to Ayin Adam Chayav, but he didn't say you're not allowed to.
But that's not the problem that we're facing. The problem that we're facing is that you're chayav, but you're not going to be equipped to do it. But it's not really your problem at any one time.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you're not able to prepare for the mitzvah beforehand.
But I'm saying, first of all, we already know you're able to.
Right. So why not also be able to make it preference?
And look, the Chai Adam is not precluding the possibility of relocating stuff. He'd certainly give you credit for that.
So you're still
yeah.
allowed to prepare or start the mitzvah beforehand.
But in the case of a bracha, either you're obligated or you're not obligated. There's no middle ground in the case of a bracha.
Well, I think you're definitely obligated to say it within the time frame if you
Correct.
haven't already said it. But I think there's a possibility that you can say it before the time frame.
I don't think so.
All right, if the fan's too strong, I can no.
What you say?
If the fan is too strong,
No, there should be a way of pushing it down, or maybe a button that shouldn't blow directly on my head. Because I forgot my earmuffs at home. Oh, it's cold.
I think you can like physically just tilt the fan up.
Now, I just want to mention, we're not going to get into it, but in the next paragraph, just give me a few minutes, he mentions, you see the bottom right, Rav Yosef Engel, and he calls him, he gives him an accolade, he gives him a nickname. He calls him Hagon Ha'adir. He was a great genius. So that's interesting that Rav Weiss gives this Gaon, this genius, an A plus. He gave him a grade. So anyway, so he says that this Gaon called Rav Yosef Engel vacillates back and forth as to whether or not you're obligated to set up the mitzvah even before the Shas HaChiyuv. And Rav Yosef Engel brings 14 different sources, half of which that say that you have to, and you're obligated to prepare for the mitzvah beforehand, and half of which say that you're not a chayav. But what I wanted to point out to you is the next paragraph that starts in the word ach. Everybody see that?
Yeah.
Let me try to present to you a very sharp move of Rav Asher Weiss that in a certain sense changes our whole perspective. But before I do that, since we were unable to find a chumash with Rashi here in this great yeshiva, which is a little shocking to me, but anyway, I want to quote to you the Rashi on this week's parsha that you might want to share with someone at the table this Shabbos, and you'll make a note of it. It is in Sefer Dvarim, Parshas Ki Tavo, Perek Chavav, Pasuk Yud Gimel. You want to write that down so you'll know where we're coming from.
What was it, Perek?
Perek Chavav, Pasuk Yud Gimel, Lo avarti mimitzvosecha v'lo shachachti. So we're talking about, again, as I said yesterday, someone who's bringing maaser or truma, and he has to make a declaration, Lo shachachti, I didn't forget. But at the beginning of the pasuk, it says, I did everything you commanded me. So why add v'lo shachachti, I didn't forget? So Rashi, quoting Chazal, says, Lo shachachti milavarech al hafrashas mas. I didn't forget to make the bracha when I was mafresh mas. So that's the takeoff point for this whole discussion of lumbus on the parsha. So what part of the parsha is it on? On v'lo shachachti, on those two extra words in the pasuk. Okay. So now we're up to this paragraph Ach, and we're moving on to page Kuf, Tov Kuf, Sadi Gimel, which would be the second page in these photocopies. Rav Weiss claims Pshita. Take a look at the third line, the last word in the third line, underline that, Pshita. Pshitoli. What does Pshita mean? Anybody know?
It's obvious.
Obvious. There's no question about it. And now you want to underline these words. The aim beflal mitzvat asay el lekayim es ha-mitzvah b'moada. So you want to emphasize the word b'moada. What's b'moada?
In its time.
In its time. So what's he saying here? He says it's pshita. I don't have any question about this hakir. Forget about this hakir. There's one side in this hakir that's correct, and there are no two sides. When do we have to be mekayim the mitzvah? B'moado. What does b'moado mean?
In its time.
In its time. Now, the next few words are very critical. And I'm going to ask you to write down a concept here that we're going to have over and over again. And that's called a bittul mitzvah, bitul mitzvah. I'll spell it for you if you want to write it down. Bet, yud, tet, vav, lam.
Remember when we turn off the air conditioning?
Say it again.
It's getting cold now. Can we turn off the air conditioning?
Just press that red
We're
switch.
going to have a fight over here.
I know.
I don't know. I could be the referee, but all right.
Just press that red switch. It should come off.
So we'll. Where is the off button? Let's see if I'm. Okay, if it gets very hot, don't tell me that. Okay. 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 So we're introducing a concept called bitul mitzvat aseh. Now, you know that all the mitzvot are divided into two: mitzvot aseh and mitzvot lo taseh. The difference being that in the case of a lo taseh, I am charged with a violation. You know, it's kind of like, let's say, a policeman finds you crossing, where you're not supposed to cross, or parking where you're not supposed to park. That's called a violation. And what does a violation entail? What does it generate? A punishment. Then you have something called a mitzvah aseh. In the case of mitzvah aseh, I have to put on tefillin. If I don't put on tefillin, I didn't violate a lo taseh. There was no official violation. Does that mean I'm great? Does that mean I'm okay? I'm in the clear? No. What's in between a mitzvah aseh and a lo taseh? It's almost halfway over to the lo taseh, but not quite there.
Bitul mitzvah.
Bitul mitzvah aseh. So write that down. Bitul mitzvah aseh. Now again, we don't have time for this. I'll just mention it very quickly. Anyone who follows this, fine. If you don't follow it, I never said a word. There are two ways of bitul mitzvah aseh. One could be active, and one could be passive. Like there's a difference between someone who fails to take a lulav and someone who takes a lulav and rips it to shreds. You follow me? So in the case of someone who fails to take a lulav, that's called a bitul aseh. That's passive. Shevi al taseh. But if somebody would go ahead and he would rip up a lulav, that would be a bitul aseh bekuv aseh, active. So like, let's say, for example, I'm not eating it all, but I don't go into the sukkah. That would be a bitul aseh b'shei v'al taseh passive. But let's say I eat outside the sukkah, that might be a bitul aseh bekuv aseh in an active. And again, anyone who followed that far, I don't even want to discuss it with you. That's way beyond the purview of this class. However, whatever it is, whichever kind of bitul aseh you're dealing with, there's something called a bitul aseh. Rav Weiss assumes here that whether or not I am obligated before the zman achiyuv in a mitzvah, like for example, if somebody would argue against the chayil and say, no, you have to relocate yourself, to maintain that position, you would therefore have to claim that if you didn't prepare by relocating yourself, then you are to be categorized or subsumed under bitul aseh. Let me go over that one more time. That's a mouthful. He's saying, Rav Weiss, which I don't know if I necessarily buy into it. He's saying that if one were to claim that even before the Zman Achiyuv, you have to get involved actively in setting up the mitzvah, then by definition, if you don't do so, you fail to do so, you are to be classified as bitul aseh, which, as we said before, is like halfway towards violating a lo taseh. It's like really bad news. And I don't see it honestly. If anybody wants to defend him against me, please do. But I'm going to say no. It could be that there is an obligation, even before the Shas HaChiyuv, to do everything in your power to set up the mitzvah so that you can fulfill it this mano. But if you fail to do so, I wouldn't go as far as to say that that's called a bittul aseh. Not necessarily. In other words, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to suggest a distinction between two concepts. One concept is, what is the obligation? And the other concept is, do I classify you as a bittul aseh because you didn't fulfill that obligation? It could be the two separate concepts. Okay, anybody want to defend Rav Weiss here?
Yeah, sure. So God commands us to complete all of his mitzvah, and though that in itself is not a mitzvah, so not doing it would not be an avera, because we're commanded to do the mitzvah, not doing the mitzvah would be bittul mitzvah.
We can't do the bittul aseh. So listen carefully, Rav Osai, because I want to introduce another concept which Rav Weiss is completely oblivious to. I don't know why, because he's a great scholar. But there's a concept called Mitzvah min hamuvcha. You want to write that down? Again, I think I'm trying to give you important concepts that'll help you. Mitzvah min hamuvcha. Can anybody take a stab at that? What does that mean, mitzvah min hamuvcha?
A mitzvah that you do by choice?
No.
A mitzvah done in the best way possible.
In the best way possible. When you talk about a chiyuv mitzvah, it's not all one continuous flat definition. The obligation to do a mitzvah could follow or can be defined in two different categories. One is what's critical for the mitzvah, and another is what enhances the mitzvah. Another phrase for enhancing a mitzvah would be mitzvah min hamuvchar. You got it?
Yeah.
So, for example, I don't know if I told you guys, I'm writing a book now on the mitzvah of Kiddush, which we love. So many complications, but I hope we'll do it. And there's one shita that I claim, nobody else saw this before me, so I might get rejected, I might get shut down, that yayin, getting wine for Kiddush, is mitzvah min hamuvcha. I could be yotze the mitzvah of Kiddush without wine. But it jacks up the mitzvah, upgrades it, if I make the Kiddush on wine. Again, I'm not asking you to get into Kiddush now. That would take, I could lecture on the mitzvah of Kiddush for the next, next 3 months, if not a half a year, because I already have 250 pages. But what I'm suggesting is this example of the mitzvah of mufchar to tell you how a chiyuv mitzvah could be subdivided into two. There could be that which is absolutely indispensable, critical, and then there could be something that is like the cherry on top, if you're familiar with that idiomatic phrase. It's just a luxury. It embellishes the mitzvah, beautifies the mitzvah, it adds to the mitzvah. I might be obligated to do that if I can, but it's only a mitzvah min hamuvchar. So I would still claim, and again, Rav Weiss would get upset about me, that even if I would tell you that there's a chiyuv to set up the mitzvah before the Shas HaChinuv, and that is an obligation, and I can't just, like you say, walk into Sukkot and say, well, I didn't buy a lulav, or walk into Rosh Hashanah, I didn't get located over here to get the shul. But that obligation is only min hamuvchar. Now, the difference is the following, on both sides. If you don't fulfill a mitzvah min hamuvchar, then you don't deserve to be classified as mevatel mitzvah. Bittul mitzvah only applies to the mainstay of the mitzvah, to the essence of the mitzvah, to that which is critical to the mitzvah. That's called ma'akev as a mitzvah. In fancy Hebrew today, modern Hebrew, I don't know if any guys studying in Ulpan or anything like that. No. Anyway, if you'll take Ulpan, one of the words they'll teach you is mahut, mem he vav tav. Again, you won't see it anywhere in the Torah. It's an Israeli creation from Ben Yehuda, I guess. Modern Hebrew. Mahut. Mahut means the essence of. So you have the essence of the mitzvah, and if you don't fulfill the essence of the mitzvah, then you're mavatal the mitzvah. But there's something that is called a mitzvah of muvchar, and it's not the essence of the mitzvah, but it just adds a dimension to the mitzvah. It enhances the mitzvah. That's called mitzvah min muvchar. So I don't know, even if I would grant you that there's a chiyuv to get involved in preparing and procuring for the mitzvah before the Zman HaChiyuv, but I would only put it in the category of an enhancement of the mitzvah. And it's not a bittul mitzvah. However, of Osher Weiss assumes that if you were to grant me that the mitzvah begins even before the Zman HaChiyuv, and I have to get involved in preparing for the mitzvah even before the Shas HaChiyuv, then he says if you don't do so, you are called a mevatel mitzvah. Go ahead.
I would argue that that doesn't follow logically because you're trying to make a break between during the Shas Chiyuv and before the Shas Chiyuv where there isn't in this respect. I would argue that there is continuation and the Chiyuv is generally prepared to be able to do the mitzvah at the minimum that is possible. Like you need to be able to do the mitzvah at the minimum. And if that is before the Shas HaChiyuv, then it applies before the Shas HaChiyuv. But if it's not, and you can make preparations during the Shas HaChiyuv, then you can make preparations during the Shas HaChiyuv.
What is your first name? Sorry for you.
Bitzal.
Bitzal. I'll get it eventually. It may take me a couple of years, but no. So Bitzal is saying that if you're obligated to set up the mitzvah before the Shas HaChiyuv, then by definition, if you didn't do so, then you won't be able to do the mitzvah. And that's what Rav Weiss means by being mevatel a mitzvah. So again, we're not talking about a separate obligation that is engendered, that's chal, before the Shas HaChiyuv, but rather we're talking about how to guarantee that you won't be a mevatel as a mitzvah when the Shas HaChiyuv comes. And therefore, Rav Weiss is assuming that if you're obligated to prepare for the mitzvah beforehand, then if you didn't do so, been failing to do so, you won't be able to fulfill the mitzvah. You're called a mevatel mitzvah. Anyway, getting back to Rav Osher Weiss, and now I want you to underline a few lines here on Tuf Kuf Tzadi Gimel. He says the following: Me'idach. Me'idach means on the other hand, and here I want you to underline Nireh Pashut. Again, Pashut. This is like before he said Pshita. Nireh Pashut. It seems to me that it's Pashut. Techova Gemura Rovetzes ala Adam Lasos es hanitzrach vanidrash lifnei zman hamitzvah. A lot of fancy Hebrew over here. He's basically saying that the mitzvah doesn't exist before the Shas HaChiyuv. That was Pshita. It's a Davar Shalom B'Olam. It's not Chal. But yet, on the other hand, we are obligated to do everything that we have to do to make sure that we'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? How can he say on the one hand that there's no obligation, and Pshita, he said it was simple to him, that ain't bechlal mitzvah seil l'kayos a mitzvah b'moada, so there's no obligation before the moed, and yet at the same time, he says he has no question and no doubt that you're obligated to do whatever you have to do before the Shas HaChiyuv.
I would say it obviously is that there's no obligation before the moed, because then it would say in Torah you have an obligation to go buy a lulav, but it wouldn't say that because like it doesn't say that. So like it's quite obvious. It is quite obvious that you do need to get what you need to get before the holiday. But making that an obligation too would mean there's just more mitzvahs, so which doesn't make sense, right?
Right, so you can't say that the mitzvah starts before the Shas HaChiyuv.
No, definitely not. Exactly.
So why am I obligated to run around looking for a lulav?
Because you're
not a
obligated.
mitzvah, but
You're
it's still-
obligated. You're not obligated to look for the lulav. You're obligated for the mitzvah of lulav. Therefore,
Wait, stop. What do you mean I'm obligated to mitzvah lulav? It's the obligation of mitzvah lulav doesn't start yet. You just finished telling me.
But
We
it
didn't
does.
start.
he's not prepared.
He
He's not
says
prepared.
Shechita,
The mitzvah
right?
still
He
exists in the
ain't
future.
bechal mitzvah seil and kaimis and mitzvah b'moada. He says that until you have the moed of the mitzvah, meaning the zman of mitzvah, then pshita, he says, it goes without saying that you can't tell him that he's obligated. So if you can't tell me he's obligated, how are
He's
you
not-
telling me
why does that
that it's
have-
partial
He's not
that I'm
obligated.
obligated before?
He's not obligated in the mitzvah until the mitzvah comes, but he's still obligated to prepare so that he knows he's going to do the mitzvah. But he needs to be ready
Okay, you're
for-
90% there. I just want to get the extra 10%. Yeah.
Hello.
Vitzal, I'm sorry.
He's saying.
Sammy said.
Um,
Vitzal.
The argument that you can't, the Torah should have said you need to buy a lulav or something like that, isn't practical because you don't need to buy a lulav. You could get a lulav some other way. You could borrow a lulav. You could do something.
Okay, but you have to borrow a lulav. He's saying that if you don't borrow lulav,
Yeah,
then you haven't fulfilled your obligation.
yeah, but the Torah couldn't say every single possible preparation you would need to do. It couldn't be comprehensive.
Okay, well, I agree with you with that. Anybody else? Yeah, what's your first name?
Sam,
Sam, of course.
So you're not obligated in the act of doing the mitzvah of lulav before lulav, but you still have a requirement to fulfill all the mitzvah
Okay.
when their time.
Excellent. And what is your first name again?
So,
Shalev. So Shalev, I'm going to put everything together here, but basically, Shalev and Sammy and Vitzal, what we're saying is the following. We're introducing now, and with this we'll conclude for the evening, another chakir. And this chakir, once again, is so fundamental, it's going to come up all the time. I'm going to first give you the Hebrew technical terminology, and then we'll try to fit it in English. So if you want to write this down, we always have to ask, what kind of a din do we have? Is it a din klali, or B, a din misuyam? Should I spell that for you? Din klali, kuf lamed lamed yud, or misuyam, mem samach vav yud mem, misuyam. Now, sometimes in the literature, instead of the word misuyam, you'll see another word, but I think in this context it might be confusing. Miyuchad, mem yud vav chet dal. So put that in parentheses. Whenever I come across a din that applies in situation X, we'll call it, I always have to ask myself the following question. Where does that din come from? Where is it rooted? Is it rooted in that particular context? Or it's just a general rule that happens to apply in that context, but it applies in many different contexts, and it's not specific. So again, a din klali is a general rule, if you want to translate that into English, and a din misuyam is a specific din. So for example, if I tell you that, getting back to Kiddush, because that's where my head is, that you need yayin for Kiddush, is that a din misuyam? Meaning it's a din in the midst of Kiddush, or no? It might be a din klali, that anytime I make a bracha to thank Hashem and praise Hashem, I need a cup of wine. Kiddush is just one example of many. That's called a din klali. Getting back to our discussion. If I tell you that you have to relocate before Rosh Hashanah to make sure that you'll hear the shofar, what kind of an obligation is that? Is that a din klali or a din misuyam?
yeah.
What do you say? Okay, we have votes in each direction. Okay, who wants to defend the position that's a din misuyam?
I don't want to defend it because I'm not
Shalem, you
right.
want to do that?
I'm only 60% ready. I'm only 60% sure I'm right.
You're
Okay,
only
I would say that it's like, it's not that you have to relocate yourself for every mitzvah you do, because some things you can do without an item. Like there are some mitzvahs you can do.
So wait a minute, do you want to say that in the mitzvah of shofar, per se, as a unique mitzvah of Yom Trua Yelachem, you have an obligation to make sure that you're there for the shofar. That's part of the mitzvah of shofar.
and say yes.
That's called a din mesuyim. What would be the argument to say it's a din kloli?
For every mitzvah, you have the obligation to make sure you have the ability to fulfill it.
So there's some sort of general obligation that applies in 613 mitzvahs, has nothing to do with any specific mitzvah, and that is do the service of Hashem, fulfill the mitzvahs of Hashem, right? Like the Torah says, "V'yavadatem es Hashem Elokeichem." You have to serve God. How do I serve God? To guarantee myself that I'll be able to fulfill the mitzvah. That's a general obligation. So therefore, Rav Weiss is going to accept two principles that we thought were mutually exclusive. On the one hand, he's going to say, pshitali, I have no doubt that the chiyuv of shofar or lulav doesn't emerge until the zman achiyuv. On the other hand, I have no doubt that you have to do everything in your power way before the shas achiyuv to guarantee that you fulfill the mitzvah. The difference is that one formulation is a din mesuyam and the other is a din kloli. So as far as the din mesuyam is concerned, well, shofar doesn't have any obligation before Rosh Hashanah. As far as the din kloli is concerned, God commands me, the Almighty commands me that I have to do everything in my power that I possibly can to serve God. That's not a din mesuyam. That doesn't emanate from the parsha of X, Y, or Z. That's part of the general mitzvah that we have to serve Hashem. For example, if I were to tell you that when you learn Torah, you have to learn besimcha, with joy, is that a din mesuyam or a din kloli?
Both.
Okay. What would Rabbi Nachman of Breslov say?
Not all. Well, he would have said it's din klali
Excellent. Why would Rabbi Nachman of Breslov say it's din kloli?
because he follows that joy is one of the most.
Mitzvah Gedol Wheels for Simcha. We always have to be Simcha. That's not a separate halach in Talmud Torah. That's not a separate halach in shofar or lulav or matzah. But we could say that the requirement of Simcha in Talmud Torah is a din mesuyam. That the mitzvah of Talmud Torah could only be fulfilled if you learn Torah b'simcha. The only question I have is that it says in Shulchan Aruch you're allowed to learn Torah on Tisha B'Av if you're learning what's called Dvarim Haroim Shebiyiria and so forth and so on. You read the parashas of the Torah that speak about destruction and about exile. How are you going to read that on Tisha B'Av b'simcha? Yeah, that's a little bit problematic. Okay, Rabbi, we'll stop here. And I appreciate your participation, and I hope you got something else. Anybody know how to shut this off?